It's always been Robyn's way, and we're just living in it. Those were the words of one of Kody's own children. And for the first time, the Brown family kids are speaking out. Secrets, favoritism, and the quiet pain that has been hidden behind the cameras for years. It's all being laid bare at last. And if you're thinking it's just a family feud, think again. What happens when the kids themselves spill the beans on who really runs their house? And more importantly, how it's influenced their lives in ways no one outside of that house has ever witnessed. Asterisk, the Brown family has always been larger than life. A rambling maze of rooms, secrets, and unspoken rules. But behind the glossy cameras and staged smiles, a quiet tension has been simmering over years, one that the kids have felt in ways no one else could really imagine. Since the earliest days of the family's expansion, Robyn's shadow had loomed large in ways that were both comforting and sometimes splitting. Some of the children describe her as the glue that keeps everything together. Others simply mutter that her favoritism drew invisible lines between siblings, lines that have become increasingly biting with the passage of years. Picture entering a room where each look, each sound of voice, seems to allude to a hierarchy you did not get to choose, yet must navigate on a daily basis. The cameras capture the celebrations, the milestones, and the laughter, but rarely the stolen moments of quiet desperation. The hallway sighs, the late-night whispered admissions, the little unguarded gestures that reveal an altogether different story. Some are pulled closer, praised more, or subtly nudged toward privileges of favor. Others, equally deserving, suffer the hurtful omission of being overlooked, their achievements quietly undermined or belittled. And it's not rooms or toys, or even attention. It's validation, being heard in a home where attention is a commodity, and affection is sometimes measured. For Kody's kids, it's a delicate dance. Love thy family, obey thy parents, but pick up fast who gets first priority, whose wisdom is listened to, whose smiles are reserved for particular times. These unspoken guidelines govern friendships, competition, and even how the kids perceive themselves. And yet, through all the silent pain, there is also resilience. There are children who have learned to cope, making small spaces of autonomy, forging deep bonds with each other that reject the unspoken lines of favoritism. There are those others who still quietly struggle, questioning whether their feelings are normal, or if this is just the way it is in a family of this size and complexity. And if you're thinking that's the whole story on this one, wait until you hear what one of the younger children revealed just a few weeks ago. Words even Kody hadn't expected. Words that start to reveal just how deep the grasp of favoritism can extend, even in a family that's designed to be together. The mood within the Brown family has always been filled with a quiet unease, a weight that the cameras rarely find. It's the little things in the manner Robyn interacts with the children. A little extra praise here, a lingering smile there, that slowly build a story that one could not see at first glance. For many of Kody's children, these little things are life-changing. For others, they instill an unseen pain, reminding them that they are in some sense less observed. One child recently compared it to straying on unstable ground. No matter how gently they walk, the ground that they stand on varies depending on the observer. Instances that are supposed to be the same, assisting around the house, working on projects at school, simply speaking up, occasionally result in intangible rewards for some, intangible barriers for others. And it may not be immediately apparent why. Robyn's authority is low-key, her agendas consistently defined as fairness. But the children observe patterns and habits, in a family of more than a dozen children, are hard to ignore. It's in the small things that the bias is unavoidable. First to be complimented for a good grade. First to be asked out on special field trips. First to be answered with a question and patience. These moments add up. And for those who come in second, or third, or last, it isn't always said, but it leaves its mark nonetheless, affecting self-esteem in ways that can carry on into eternity. Some of the younger kids have learned to accommodate, to read Robyn's preferences and dislikes and navigate around them, wearing resilience as armor. But resilience comes at a cost. It may be a choice to stifle feelings, swallow frustration, or question one's value. And yet, there is also hope, commitment, and a desire to maintain the family unit, which keeps them in the delicate balance between expressing their concern and biting it back. And it's not all about attention. Think again if you thought so. These unspoken divides open wide, impacting sibling friendships, trust, and even celebratory moments. The seething resentment, the jealousy, and the hunger for recognition don't all burst at once. They simmer. And sometimes, quite unexpectedly, they crack open holes in the family fabric that no one recognizes until they can no longer be ignored. And just when you think you understand the depth of this conflict, one revelation is made that turns everything on its head. Something the children themselves discovered about something that occurred years earlier. A moment that revealed the consequences of favoritism in a way no one may ever have imagined. It was otherwise a humdrum afternoon at the Brown household, yet to the kids, humdrum days usually had secret lessons. One of the little ones, sitting quietly in the corner observing, noticed the way Robyn would stay a bit longer when she spoke with certain siblings, laugh a bit louder at their jokes, or reprimand them a bit differently from the way others weren't even sure they were doing something wrong. Initially, it was random, even benign, but as time went by, the patterns became impossible to ignore. For the kid on the outside of these subtle distinctions, each interaction began to feel weighted. Even tiny things, a disregarded hug, an unspoken compliment, an overlooked question, piling up, bore more than words could possibly convey. And yet, it was difficult to articulate. How do you handle favoritism within a family that is all about the appearance of things and the perception of equality? How do you say what you think when the very people who are supposed to be keeping you safe and secure seem blind or indifferent to see? The older kids among them began to trust each other, confiding in one another the unsaid truth that they had all had different experiences in the house, that love and attention were scarce and rationed out, and that these unspoken hierarchies had profound consequences. Sibling bonds were a refuge, where the truth could be told without fear of judgment or denial. These fleeting moments of mutual comprehension were small islands of relief in the sea of complicated family life, but they only served further to instill the awareness of how prejudice could affect identity and self-worth. And yet, the children's reflections were not merely of suffering, of love, devotion, and the necessity to protect the family tie. They spoke with pride of Robyn's labors, her ability to manage such a large family, and her undeniable role in preserving the family tie. Pride was, however, accompanied by frustration, with silent questions on justice and equity, questions they held quietly until now. And if you're tempted to think it's just a matter of feeling, the stakes are real too. Opportunities, favors, and even life decisions sometimes rest on who manages to catch the ear of a parent first. Who gets to attend specific functions? Who gets consulted? Who gets assistance when confronted with challenges? These little advantages build up over time and decide futures that most observers aren't even aware of. And in the quiet, as the children finally gained their voice, a stillness started to simmer. Sentences that had been stifled for decades finally made it into speech, each revelation peeling away layers of hypocrisy, revealing just how deeply discrimination had infiltrated the very fiber of their lives. The day started as every day did in the Brown household, but beneath the surface, there was growing tension. It was one of Kody's children who quietly recalled an episode from years ago, a small thing in its nature, but an explosive one in its implication. It was a birthday party, a low-key event meant to mark one of the younger children's special day, but what transpired revealed the underlying rules of concentration in the family. Robyn had remained back with some of the older children, exchanging compliments, laughter, and familiarity that was so natural. But to those looking in, the silence was overwhelming. It was not a case of cruel intent. For the most part, the children understood that Robyn's favor was not always a deliberate blessing. It was, after all, a question of personality, timing, or circumstances. And yet, patterns do not lie. When the same kids are continually noticed first, complimented more, or pushed ahead with gentle rewards, it leaves a mark. Over time, These small acts of exclusion, these omitted gestures, create a rich patchwork of feelings, resentment, confusion, and furtive longing. A few of the younger kids began to internalize these models. They asked questions no child should ever ask. Am I not good enough? Do my efforts matter at all? Why am I always second to someone else? And though they seemed content, assisted with the chores, and conformed to the family's routines, inwardly, a different page was being written. Each unasked question, each unnoted accomplishment, became a small echo that sang of unfairness, of imbalanced attention. But there were moments of strength, of quiet rebellion. Amidst the tension, some of the children began to claim for themselves, in ways that could not be ignored, volunteering to do chores, excelling in schoolwork, or finding means of demanding notice without complaining. Others simply retreated into secluded observation, meticulously noting who was rewarded and who was not, analyzing the rules of emotional life in a house that seemed to reward some and leave others invisible. And if you think the story stops there, think again. One of the older siblings recently revealed something jaw-dropping, that they had, year in and year out, subtly measured themselves against siblings in ways that impacted every decision, every dream, and every family relationship. The admission disclosed the depth of favoritism, not as one incident, but as a subterranean tide that held sway over the entire family. And in that quiet confession, the line between love and unfairness was crossed, leaving a question asked today: when does affection turn one-sided, and when does favoritism leave scars that reach far beyond childhood? Favoritism's dynamics did not only echo in ordinary moments, it reached into the center of choices, shaping how the children thought about themselves and each other. One of Kody's older kids described how even the tiniest choices, like who sat closest together to have dinner, or who received additional guidance with homework, were implicitly significant. For the outside world, the experiences might have been meaningless, but within the Brown family, they were markers of inclusion, badges of concern, and soft grumbles of self-worth. For other children, this constant balancing of attention created a muted anxiety, a pre-speaking or pre-performance necessity to scan Robyn's reaction. Was something worth asking, or would it be dismissed? Was an achievement worthy, or would it go unseen? These were the mental calculations running unseen in the minds of children who had learned while they were growing up that affection and attention were not invariably distributed evenly. But even in the midst of this quiet tension, there were moments of unexpected connection. A glance, a smile, a whispered remark between siblings gave release, a reminder that compassion and understanding could exist alongside the lack of fairness. And for those fleeting instants, bonds grew stronger, forging secret networks of trust that helped children navigate lives through a home where favoritism quietly ruled emotional landscapes. But the weight of these imbalances was not always evident. Some children learned to adapt, covering disappointment with smiles, finding means of gaining attention without confrontation. Others struggled in private, confidence eroding as repetition went on year upon year. And if you think that only trivial concerns were at issue, reflect again. Recent reflection shows these power structures to have had lasting effects, throwing shadows over ambition, conditioning friendships outside the home, and even affecting those within the family itself. And then there was the revelation that even surprised the children themselves. One of the siblings recounted an incident that had never previously been discussed, a family trip on which the disparity in the way Robyn was treated was so blatant, it created immediate tension and hurt feelings that endured for weeks. It wasn't a single moment of favoritism, it was a public recognition of the informal hierarchy that had been operating quietly in the household. And in the midst of revelation was a truth. Favoritism had not been an oversight, wittingly or unwittingly. It had created a world where certain children thrived by being in the spotlight, while others quietly doubted their worth. And while the children spun their stories, there was a bigger narrative that was conceived, one that challenged the notion of a harmonious household and asked, can love ever be equal in a home where attention is distributed disproportionately? By then, the subtle undertones of favoritism were hard to avoid. One of Kody's children recalled an illustrative episode at a typical family gathering. It wasn't melodramatic in the old-fashioned way. No screaming, no confrontation, but the little things shouted. Robyn's eye lingered on some siblings longer. Her reprimand came faster. Her laugh came more easily. To those on the outside, the message rang loud and clear. Some voices were heard more clearly. Some smiles came easier. And some hearts were broken more with yearning. It is in these situations that self-concept in childhood begins to distort under pressure. A praise that comes only to a sibling, a smile of approval barely visible, unevenly given, can echo in a child's mind longer than the instant itself. Some of the children took these disparities with them as inner failures, questioning whether their efforts were ever good enough. Others, frustrated but obstinate, began seeking validation in other places, entering peer relationships, or just looking to each other for a sense of security. And yet, the children's minds were not all sour. They knew Robyn's work ethic, her trying to keep this diverse household functioning, and the love she must feel for every child. But love, they came to realize, does not always feel equal, and uneven attention can construct barriers even within a family that appears to be unified. The tension between thanks and resentment became a tacit subtext in everyday life, tainting interactions in subtle but profound ways. And if you imagine that these are nothing but minor ripples, think about what followed. One of the children described a time when something, a chance to lead, a privilege, was handed to another sibling, seemingly out of the blue, while his own request was disregarded. The incident triggered whispers, low-key comparisons, and enduring doubt about fairness. It wasn't some one-time incident. It was a glass showing years of known graspable pecking order. And in that still quiet, something shifted. The children who had grown accustomed to charting these effective landscapes in silence for so many years started to voice their feelings, cautiously at first, then increasingly clearly. Their stories revealed more than favoritism alone. They revealed the emotional toll of growing up within a family in which love, attention, and approval were meted out with measured precision, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. And with all the truth out there was another question lingering in the air, unasked until now. How do you love an inequality? And can a family remain emotionally intact if some hearts are heavier than others? By now, the patterns of preferment had left indelible marks on Kody's children. One of the older children told us that it was like walking around the house with invisible weights attached to the shoulders. Each look, each sentence, each little show of attention or dismissal was amplified, defining not only their day-to-day experiences, but even themselves. The more they watched, the sharper the lines, and the stronger the quiet anger grew. There were also moments of passive resistance, small gestures that articulated a child's awareness of the unspoken rules. A witty remark, an acute question, or a rebellious insistence on being instructed became ways of claiming notice, of tilting the scales, even for just a moment. But these attempts were typically intentional, calculated, and with an edge of fear. All of the children learned quickly. Step out of line, and the attention may cease. Get in line, and finally they would feel seen. And yet, through the ordeal, their affection for the family did not lessen. The children expressed admiration for Robyn's resiliency in managing so many lives intact, in harmonizing schedules, meals, and emotions with a seeming ease that left other people amazed. But anger and respect coexisted awkwardly, filling each interaction with tension. The more the children tried to understand, the more they valued the contradiction of her role, nurturer and go-between, bringer of warmth and inadvertently, bringer of imbalance. And if you think these forces were enacted only in small mundane choices, think again. One of the children recalled another highly publicized episode, a family celebration in which the discrepancies in praise became impossible to ignore. What should have been a wide shared pleasure instead served to highlight the invisible fences of favor, leaving some of the children glowing with commendation and others standing silently by, their accomplishments and feelings overlooked. It was an experience that left a psychic bruise, one that lasted infinitely longer than anyone expected. Looking back at these experiences, the children were able to see patterns that extended beyond the household. Friendships, classroom relationships, and even confidence were subtly molded by years of comparing who was observed and who wasn't. It wasn't a matter of love or likability, it was an entire system of seeing invisible but unmistakably powerful. And with that understanding, some questions did start to surface. Could a family ever actually be happy when attention and worry weren't being handed out fairly? And if childhood had already been conditioned by favoritism, what does this bode for the way these children subsequently experience adulthood, relationships, and self-esteem? It was during an evening spent quietly in the Brown home that one of the younger children finally reached a point where she decided to complain. For years, thoughts and feelings had been carefully tucked away, observations stored in silence, comparisons made internally without voice. But on that night, a truth emerged, a confession that would change how the family, and perhaps the audience, perceived the delicate dynamics of attention and favoritism. "I've always felt invisible," the child admitted. The words were simple, almost hesitant, but they carried the weight of years of unseen moments. Invisible on birthdays, invisible in milestones, invisible in everyday praise. For some, an elusive feeling; for others, constant undertow that had an impact on their confidence, their self-worth, and their relationship with their siblings. And when the words were spilling off the child's lips, a silence fell in the room. A silence loaded with knowledge and silent acknowledgement. The older brothers nodded, listening intently, remembering their own similar experiences. It was not one child. It was a strand that ran through many stories, each unique but together having the collective sense of being politely overlooked. And if you think that this was just emotional exaggeration, the subsequent stories listed concrete consequences, missed opportunities, persistent self-doubt, and the quiet calculation of every move to get attention that should have flowed automatically. And yet, within this weakness, there was strength. The majority of the children had learned to navigate the hard terrain, offering assistance to one another, building hidden moments of appreciation and enjoyment, and at times bare survival. Their coping mechanisms were adaptive, resolute, and unobtrusively heroic. And within those hidden places, friendship, laughter, and commitment flourished, illustrating that even in imbalance, the family was able to create islands of love that were intact. But the secrets didn't end there. A different child shared a tellingly anecdotal recollection of a school event, where the uneven attention at home showed up as comparison and insecurity among peers. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a reminder that the invisible hierarchies in the home had outside world effects on confidence, relationships, and identity beyond the walls of the family. And if you think these stories are only about minor favoritism, think again. They are about perception, emotional weight, and forming a generation. They are about the way small acts of kindness, accumulated over time, can build a landscape on which love and attention are distributed unevenly, and thus some hearts heavier than others. And as the children continue speaking, one question looms above the rest. When love is not equally distributed, do family ties remain intact? Or do the cracks widen unseen, shaping the future in ways no one can undo? As the children's confessions continued, the unobtrusive fractures caused by favoring became impossible to ignore. Siblings who had once laughed together without thinking were now beginning to realize inequalities in treatment, shifts of tone, moments of acknowledgement, the uneven distribution of interest that had quietly shaped their interactions over the years. What had once seemed minor nuances took on weighty significance, influencing friendships, trust, and even loyalty among the children. One child explained one such occasion where two siblings were praised at once for the same achievements, but the pride and admiration showered on one eclipsed the other totally. The neglected sibling felt invisible, and yet he had done nothing wrong. These repeated occurrences over time generated an emotional pecking order in which the children not only compared themselves to their parents' approval, but to each other as well. Comparing, jealousy, and a need for validation became constant companions. But these challenges also spurred resourcefulness and resilience. Some children learned to adapt to the complicated patterns, discovering methods of gaining attention without conflict. Cute tricks, witty jokes, or strategic timing. Others helped each other out, forging secret relationships and coalitions that created a clandestine system that could survive years of uneven attention. In these dynamics, they discovered that love and sympathy were still possible when parental approval felt disproportionate. Yet even resilience had its limit. The constant feeling of being overlooked, the unstated anger, and the desire for justice began to condition self-image in ways that could no longer be ignored. One of the older siblings admitted that they always questioned their ability and worth, wondering whether their successes actually mattered or if they were destined to forever dwell in others' shadows. And if you think these are mere childhood frustrations, think again. They're ingrained emotional tendencies that can still have a hold long into adulthood. Next came the bombshell that even the siblings were stunned by. One of the younger kids described a situation in which favoritism had an overt impact on a family opportunity, a privilege or activity that should have been accessible on an equal basis, but wasn't. The story demonstrated not just the emotional but the material consequences of unequally distributed attention, resulting in quiet tension that traveled throughout the family. And at that moment, it was clear favoritism was not a temporary issue. It was a force that determined relationships, self-worth, and the family's very existence. And the question left, hanging in the minds of the children and the crowd alike, was unavoidable. If there can be unbalanced love, how does one family hold intact? And what happens when finally the invisible weight of bias comes into the open? The tension at home in the Brown household had been growing in silence for years. But with the kids speaking openly now, the unspoken rules of special treatment became impossible to circumvent. One of them remembered a holiday party where attention allocation was lopsided. Gifts, attention, and guidance were subtly skewed to some of the children to the exclusion of others, and left them feeling overlooked, unseen, and subtly wounded. It was not done with ill will, but the effect was real. A sensitive reminder of the way in which they had been subtly influenced by favoritism. Observations by the children revealed more than uneven attention. They revealed patterns that characterized their personalities, goals, and relationships. For all on the receiving end of praise all the time, assertiveness and self-confidence grew stronger, eventually repaid in turn with opportunities and spotlight. But for others hovering behind the scenes, self-doubt and insecurities crept in, influencing school options, social cliques, and even how they spoke at home. And if you think it ends at childhood, think again. These routines ripple far beyond the boundary of home, leaving resonances that follow them into adulthood. But amidst the frustration and sorrow, there were flashes of understanding. The children observed Robyn's incessant working to balance a massive household and keep everyone tranquil. They caught glimpses of the love she shared, though at times in imbalanced portions. And in that preview, a chaotic reality lay before us. Love and favoritism are not opposites, but rather are able to shape relationships that are both deepening and challenging. And then came the most damning revelation to date. One of the kids described an incident when a gesture of favoritism had quite literally influenced a life-altering choice, a choice involving participation, luck, or accountability that should have been leveled for all but was not. The incident was small in scale, but titanic in emotional impact, a testament to how patterns of favoritism could shift from subtle suggestions and into precise consequences. And in the aftermath of this confession, the kids saw something deep. Favoritism is not merely an emotional construct. Its impact is structural, built into daily interactions, decisions, and family hierarchies. Undefined. And if you thought you saw the whole story, think twice. The stories continue, accumulating new depths, and asking questions that linger long after the conversation is over. Can a family ever heal when favoritism has shaped so many childhoods? And what does one do when the hidden fault lines finally come up into light? By then, the weight of favoritism was indisputable. The children no longer were talking in terms of abstraction. They were talking about specific episodes that had lingered with them for decades, shaping their concept of family love and equality. One of the elder siblings remembered a birthday party at which the disparity in attention given to children was so pronounced that it still registered. Approbation and merriment flowed unevenly. And for some, joy was balanced against muted disappointment. The unwritten order visible in each glance, each word, each step. It was in the small, ordinary moments that distinctions were made. Who was addressed first? Who was easiest to praise? Who could ask without being put down? The children had absorbed these variations early on, and gradually they became a part of behavior, anticipation, and even sibling allegiance. Some tried to win attention through achievement, others to exist in silence, and a few to establish covert allegiances, creating shadowy webs of security and comfort to counter the quiet differences. And yet, even in these difficult revelations, there was nuance. There was a sense of knowing among most of the children about Robyn's mammoth effort, the late nights balancing schedules, meals, and attitudes. There was an awareness that there was love, but it was intertwined with favoritism, and a conflict between adoration and irritation. It was a messy reality. A parent loved all the children, and yet favoritism, whether conscious or unconscious, still left scars that could never be erased. Following was a discovery that even caught the siblings off guard. One of the siblings described how favoritism had influenced a pivotal moment, a decision about responsibility, privilege, or possibility that should have been equitable, but certainly was not. The incident, though apparently trivial to a bystander, held emotional power that persisted for decades. It was proof that favoritism wasn't just sneaky, it had tangible, lasting consequences. And don't think these moments were solitary. Various kids verified such events, routines that had worked behind the scenes to define daily life and their own perception of themselves in profound ways. They were stories of the unobserved framework of the house, how attention, affection, and praise were disproportionately allocated, how children learned to swim through those currents, and how that affected not only home relations, but their assurance and sense of self. And as the children spoke, one question was impossible to avoid. If love and attention can be unequal within a family, how do the invisible repercussions define the adults they are growing up to be? And what will it take for these wounds to heal at last? The tension that had been quietly building over the years now came into sharp relief. One of Kody's kids recalled a moment that had haunted them years later, a family gathering in which favoritism was plain. Robyn's attention, warm and supportive to some, brushed by others at best, reducing them to invisibility and passive resentment. And in the instant, the kid realized that these actions weren't random, that they were part of an omnipresent, habitual pecking order that had dictated every moment of their life. It wasn't always the little things that mattered. The children revealed that opportunities, privilege, and praise were often skewed. Who went on special quests? Who got guidance and attention when most in need? Whom did one praise and whom did one silently forget? These questions, repeated repeatedly across years, had made irreversible impressions on the children's self-esteem, self-perception, and sibling relationships. What seemed at first like love at first sight was complex, a mix of commitment and involuntary prejudice that no child could escape. And yet, there was strength. Most of the children found a way to adapt, to thrive in the face of the imbalance. They created their own support networks, leaned on each other, and learned quiet ways of asserting themselves. A joke whispered, a secret confided, a quiet act of courage. These were lifelines, small acts of resistance to the forces beyond their sight that shaped their daily lives. And it was through these small triumphs that they gained strength, courage, and empathy that would carry them far further from the walls of the brown house. But the emotional cost was real. One of the kids described how repeated exposure to being overlooked led them to question their worth, their abilities, and inwardly comparing themselves to siblings. And if you think these are childish irritations, the truth is much deeper. Favoritism affected identity, relationships, and even the direction their ambitions pursued. And then there was the most startling confession of all. A child admitted that a choice had been made out of favoritism, one that had altered their prospects, their self-worth, and even their dynamics with their siblings. The confession underscored the profound implications of partial attention, and the impact was emotional but tangible in daily life. And when these facts became apparent, a question hung in the air: is it possible to love unconditionally when there is divided attention? And how do children become adults unscathed by the unseen burden of favoritism that has subtly molded their entire childhood? As the children continued to ponder, the overall effect of favoritism became irrefutable. Every story, every anecdote, presented a picture of a family where love was plentiful, Yes, but where time and attention were disproportionately distributed. It was like treading on a tightrope. One older brother said, staying on the wire, staying away from stepping on toes, staying away from causing offense as one navigated the subtle, invisible hierarchies that had governed their childhood. It never was obvious why certain siblings received more attention. Sometimes it was personality, sometimes timing, sometimes an unconscious pattern that Robyn herself might not have valued. But the effect was certain. For those who were habitually ignored, even simple moments, completing a task, responding to a question, sharing a joke, carried the weight of uncertainty. Would this be counted? Would this be seen? Or would it go unnoticed in the background? And yet, in this imbalance, the kids also found creativity and resilience. Some found alternatives to emerge without strife, others relied on secret alliances among siblings, and others created humor or artfulness as ways of getting through the complicated emotional terrain of the home. Even in moments of mute suffering, connections were formed, laughter continued, and loyalty remained. They learned to survive, to get by, and to fend for themselves emotionally, skills they would take with them long after childhood. But the enduring impact was real. Some children admitted that being favored had shaped how they thought about themselves, how they dealt with problems, and even how they related to each other. Rivalries were fueled, self-doubt grew, and confidence was not well developed. It wasn't about love, or the absence of love, it was the quiet, invisible shaping of identity, the subtle weighing of focus that left deep scars on hearts and minds. And if you think the stories are finished, think again. One of the younger children pulled out a recent instance that replayed old patterns of years past, an interaction in which attention and praise were once more unequal, reawakening old feelings and reminding them that favoritism was not so much memory trapped as actively present, insidiously infiltrating day-to-day existence and sculpting interactions both overt and subtle. And in that recognition, there was one haunting question: if youth is defined by love and guidance, how do you weigh the love that you did receive against the moments when you were forgotten? How do you emerge adult and untethered from the unspoken pressures of favor? And can a family ever be whole when some hearts have carried such unspoken burdens for so many years? By this time, years of tiptoeing around favoritism bore inescapably upon the children. One of them reflected upon how even small moments, excessive praise, slight pushes, a smile held a fraction too long, had made permanent impressions upon their sense of self. They weren't fleeting moments, they were habits, repeated again and again, subtly impacting confidence, motivation, and sibling relationships. Some children had learned to adjust. They learned to predict who would get caught first, who would be led more smoothly, and who would most likely be overlooked. They developed strategies, diplomatic, wary, and at times brilliant, to capture moments of notice without conflict. Others relied on private alliances, shared confidences, or inner humor, creating sanctuaries within a household that sometimes felt like a game of unwritten rules. And in those small triumphs, they acquired resilience, flexibility, and the ability to persevere, even when the odds seemed hopelessly against them. But the psychic cost was real. Self-doubt, quiet anger, an ongoing sense of invisibility, had warped personalities and choices, raising questions of value and belonging that persisted long after childhood. Even now, as the children talked openly, the old feelings came rushing back, reminders that bias isn't a theoretical concept. It is a real force that echoes through decades, changing perspectives and relationships. And then came the greatest shock of all. One of the children admitted that favoritism had not only touched daily life, but turning points, opportunities, decisions, and experiences that should have been shared equally. The effect was also emotional and functional, shaping the way brothers and sisters saw themselves and each other, and leaving them with scars that were invisible but lasting. And if you believe we're finished here, think again. The confessions were a multifaceted truth. Love and bias can coincide, respect and bitterness can walk hand in hand, and bonds can last even in the shadow of invisible hierarchies. But the haunting question remained unspoken, yet undeniably unavoidable. How do you reconcile the love you were offered with the instances when you were withheld? And more so, can family ever heal when some have carried invisible weights for so long? As the voices of the children faded, it was clear that one thing had left its indelible multifaceted stamp on both the immediate and the future. The father's favoritism, leaving the family, as well as the audience, with a query that cannot be answered in a cut-and-dry manner. With the confessions and the reflection at an end, the weight of the years spent living with favoritism lingered in the periphery like an understood storm. The children's stories, once confided and hidden, were now irrefutable realities, evidence of the subtle yet powerful ways attention and recognition shape their lives. They were stories of pleasure, laughter, and resilience, and of muted suffering, self-doubt, and the insistent question of justice that followed them into manhood. The experience had forged resilience in some. They had learned to chart their own courses, and to establish bonds of trust and loyalty that transcended parental appeasement. By themselves during quiet moments, brothers and sisters became friends to each other, discovering common comprehension and compassion that could not be ravaged by partiality. And yet, even resilience had its cost. The constant prodding of imperceptible hierarchies, the subtle math of each encounter, and the careful balancing of effort against acknowledgement had made their marks. The older children reflected on how these moments had shaped their identity, aspirations, and relationships. Confidence, self-esteem, and emotional expression were all quietly formed through the ebb and flow of attention across time. And while some of the instances of favoritism were likely unconscious, the impact was very real, causing visible and invisible wounds. And if you think that this is a tale about childhood, think again. The echoes of these instances resonate far beyond the home, playing out in friendships, career choices, and even the ways the children bond with their own future kin. The invisible powers of favoritism have shaped more than daily existence. These powers have left a lasting mark on identity, perception, and what it means to love. And while the voices of the children fade into introspection, one thing is clear: love and attention are not always distributed equally, even among families bound together by loyalty and love. And perhaps the most haunting question of all remains unspoken: if bias results in hidden injuries that shape who we become, how can we know it, heal from it, and prevent its shadow from moving into the future generation? The Brown children have testified. Their testimony is candid, honest, and disturbing. But it is only the beginning on a conversation many families will be forced to have. And as we ponder their words, the question remains open, one to which no easy answer may be had, and one that will continue to echo in our minds long after we leave this place. What does it actually mean to love just as much, when hearts can feel more or less full, simply based on who gets to be seen first?